The ship was ugly. Everyone at Aethys Prime could see that. While crystal dreadnoughts and living bioships floated in perfect formation around the station, the human vessel Perseverance came out of faster-than-light travel with a rough shudder and a flash of blue light that flickered twice before going steady. It was gray. It was blocky. It looked like someone had welded 100 metal boxes together and stuck an engine on the back. On the observation deck of Aethys Prime, a Luminara diplomat, a being made entirely of golden light, watched the ship approach and made a sound that in any language meant the same thing. Disappointment. "That is their flagship?" he asked. "That is their only ship of this class," replied his aide. The Luminara said nothing more. He didn't need to. Aethys Prime was the political center of the known galaxy. It was a station the size of a small moon, built in orbit around a dying red star 4,000 years ago by species that no longer existed. Now it belonged to the Galactic Council, the largest and oldest alliance of intelligent life ever formed. Over 4,300 species held seats in its great conclave chamber. They governed trade routes, settled wars, regulated technology, and decided who mattered in the galaxy and who did not. Humanity, it was widely agreed, did not matter. They had only made first contact 18 years ago, when a Tessic trading ship had stumbled into their solar system and found, to everyone's surprise, a species that had already put robots on neighboring planets and sent radio signals into the dark for over a century. The Tessic had made a quick profit selling them basic star maps and moved on. Most species heard about humans the way they heard about any new primitive. A brief mention in a science report, a joke at a trade meeting, a footnote. But 18 years later, here they were, asking to join the council. No species had ever applied so soon. Most civilizations waited 300 years or more, slowly learning the rules, building relationships, proving they deserved a seat. Humans had waited less than 2 decades and apparently decided that was long enough. Ambassador Alora Mwangi walked off the Perseverance and onto Aethys Prime with a small team of 12. She was tall for a human, with dark skin and short silver hair, and the kind of calm, steady eyes that made people, human or otherwise, pay attention when she spoke. She wore a simple dark blue uniform with Earth's emblem on her shoulder. No jewels, no ceremonial armor, no hovering attendants. Just 12 people in neat clothes carrying data pads. The station's welcoming committee was led by a minor Valith official, an insectoid with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected light like black mirrors. The Valith were one of the 3 elder races of the council, ancient and powerful, and absolutely certain of their own superiority. Sending a minor official to greet the humans was, of course, an insult. Elara knew it. She smiled anyway. "Welcome to Aethys Prime," the official said in flat, translated tones. "Your quarters are in the outer ring, Section 47. I trust you can find your way." Section 47 was where they put species that were expected to fail. It was far from the conclave chamber, far from the good restaurants, and right next to the waste recycling systems. The air there smelled faintly of chemicals. "Lovely," said Alara. "We'll make ourselves at home." Her team settled in without complaint. They unpacked their things, set up their equipment, and started preparing for the summit. If any of them were bothered by the smell, or the tiny rooms, or the message behind them, they did not show it. The 4012th Galactic Council Summit began the next morning. The conclave chamber was vast, a circular amphitheater that could hold representatives from every member species at once. Thousands of platforms floated at different heights, each one carrying a delegation. Holographic translators filled the air with overlapping voices in 100,000 languages. Light and color and sound crashed together like waves. The human delegation was given a platform near the bottom, the worst seats in the house. Alara stood at the front of her platform and looked up. Above her, stretching into the hazy distance, were the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. The Dra-Kun, Massive reptilian warriors, each one 3 meters tall, with thick scaled hides and 4 eyes that burned like hot coals, sitting in platforms built like warships. The Luminara, floating in spheres of pure light, and thousands more. Empires that had existed before humanity had learned to make fire. When it was her turn to speak, Alara stepped forward, and the chamber grew just a little quieter, not out of respect, out of curiosity. The way a crowd goes quiet when an animal does something unexpected. "Thank you," she began, and her voice was carried by the translators to every corner of the room. "My name is Alara Mwangi, and I speak for Earth. We are young, we know that. We come from one star, one small planet, and we have been part of the galactic community for less than 20 years. By your standards, we are children." She paused and looked around the chamber. "But children grow, and we grow fast. We are here to offer partnership, trade, cultural exchange, scientific collaboration. We believe we have something to give and much to learn. We ask for a seat at this table, not because we think we have earned it yet, but because we believe in what this council can be." It was a good speech, simple, honest, and warm. In a fair galaxy, it might have mattered. The response was polite and terrible. Species after species rose to ask questions that were not really questions. They were statements dressed up in polite language. How could humans contribute when their technology was so far behind? How could they be trusted when their own history was full of war? Were they not perhaps a little too ambitious for their own good? Alara answered every question with patience and grace. She never lost her temper. She never raised her voice. High above the chamber floor, in a private observation pod reserved for senior Valith officials, Counselor Siveth watched the human ambassador with all 6 of his eyes. Siveth was old, even by Valith standards. He had seen species come and go. He had seen empires rise and fall. Very little surprised him anymore. But something about the humans made his antenna twitch. He pulled up a data screen and scrolled through the files his research team had prepared. Humanity's technological progress over the last 18 years, their adaptation rate, their population growth, their ability to absorb and improve alien technology they had traded for. The numbers were strange. Not impressive in the way the Drakun were impressive, with their massive fleets and brutal efficiency. Not elegant like the Luminara, or precise like the Valith. Just fast. Unreasonably, unnervingly fast. Siveth closed the screen and sat very still for a long time. Then he called his aide and said, "Schedule a meeting with the senior council members. Tonight. Private. No record." "What shall I tell them it concerns?" the aide asked. Siveth looked down at the tiny human platform far below, where Alara Mwangi was shaking hands with a Garathi diplomat and laughing at something he had said. "Tell them," Siveth said quietly, "that we have a problem." The night before the vote, Counselor Siveth met with 14 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy in a room that did not officially exist. The room was deep inside Aethys Prime, past 3 security checkpoints and 2 identity scans. It had no windows, no recording devices, and no furniture except a single long table made of black stone. The elder races had been meeting in rooms like this for thousands of years, places where real decisions were made, far away from the grand speeches and holographic displays of the conclave chamber. Siveth stood at the head of the table, his forearms folded behind his back, his compound eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the data projections floating in front of him. "They applied after 18 years, he said. No introduction, no pleasantries. The Valith did not believe in wasting time on words that carried no information. The fastest previous application was the Rel Compact, and they waited 312 years. The humans are not following the pattern. They are not following any pattern. A Dracoon general named Torvan leaned forward, his massive frame making the chair beneath him groan. So they are eager. Eager is not dangerous. Eager is foolish. Look at this, Sci-Fi said, and the data projections expanded to fill the room. Charts, graphs, timelines, the technological progress of every species that had ever joined the Council, mapped against their years of development. Most followed a gentle curve. Slow growth, then a long plateau, then slow growth again. Thousands of years to move from one stage to the next. The human line was not a curve. It was almost a straight line going up. And it was getting steeper. The room was quiet for a moment. That cannot be correct, said a Luminara elder, her light flickering with doubt. Your data must be flawed, Sci-Fi replied. I have checked it 11 times. It is correct. In 18 years, they have gone from basic interplanetary travel to functional, faster-than-light capability. They did not invent it themselves. They traded for the core technology from the Tessic. But they improved it. The Tessic drive loses 12% efficiency over long jumps. The human version loses 3%. They made it better in 6 years. The Tessic has been using the same drive for 900 years. Another silence. This one was heavier. What are you suggesting? Torvan asked. I am suggesting, Sci-Fi said carefully, that if we give them a seat on this council, they will outgrow it within a century. They will not be content to sit at the bottom. They will push. They will innovate. They will form alliances with every minor species that feels ignored by us. And eventually, they will challenge the balance of power that has kept this galaxy stable for 4,000 years. Then, we deny them, said the Luminara elder simply. We deny them, and we watch them. If they become a threat, we deal with them. Sci-Fi nodded slowly. That is what I am recommending. But we must be careful about how we do it. If we reject them openly with hostility, we create sympathy for them. We make them into victims. Other species will rally to their cause. Instead, we reject them gently. We say they are not ready. We say it is for their own protection. We make it sound like kindness. And so the plan was set. The next day, the conclave chamber was full. Every platform was occupied. Every holographic screen was active. The vote on Earth's membership had drawn more attention than anyone had expected, not because anyone thought the humans would be accepted, but because everyone wanted to see what would happen when they were not. The debate began in the morning and lasted all day. It was, in theory, an open discussion where any species could speak for or against the application. In practice, it was a performance. The ending had already been written. Speaker after speaker rose to explain, very politely, why humanity was not ready. The Chalori, a species of tall, thin beings with silver skin, expressed concern about human aggression. Their own historical records show over 15,000 armed conflicts in their last 3,000 years alone, the Chalori ambassador said, shaking his narrow head. This is not a species at peace with itself. The Behel, silicon-based engineers who rarely spoke in council sessions, offered a technical objection. Their infrastructure is insufficient. They cannot maintain a council-level communication network. They do not have the manufacturing capacity. Membership requires participation, and they simply cannot participate at the required level. A Nomari navigator, speaking from a platform that drifted slowly through the chamber like a small cloud, said humans were too attached to their single planet and lacked the psychological framework for true galactic citizenship. On and on it went. Each objection was reasonable on its surface. Each one was delivered with a tone of regret, as if the speakers truly wished things were different. Nobody said anything cruel. Nobody called the humans stupid or worthless. They just explained, calmly and rationally, why the answer had to be no. A few voices spoke in humanity's favor. The Goroth the ambassador, A small green-skinned amphibian with enormous golden eyes stood on his tiny platform and said that he had visited Earth and found humans to be curious, warm, and full of surprises. The Tessic trade representative noted that commerce with Earth had been profitable and that humans honored their contracts. A delegation of 3 minor species from the Outer Rim said they supported Earth's application because the Council needs new perspectives. They were listened to politely and ignored completely. Then Warlord Kethon of the Dracoons stood. The chamber went very quiet. The Dracoon did not speak often in council debates, but when they did, people listened, partly out of respect, mostly out of fear. Kethon was enormous even by Dracoon standards, a wall of muscle and dark green scales with a voice like stone grinding against stone. "I have studied the humans," he said. "They have spirit. I will give them that. Their warriors are brave. Their history shows they do not surrender easily. But bravery without power is just stubbornness. They are larvae. They play at being predators, but they are not predators. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I vote no." He sat down. The matter was effectively settled. The final speech came from Councillor Scythith himself. He rose slowly, his dark carapace gleaming under the chamber lights, and spoke in the measured, precise tone that the Valith were famous for. "Earth's application is remarkable," he began. "To come so far in so short a time is truly impressive. And it is precisely because of this that we must exercise caution. The galactic community is complex. Its politics are old and deep. To bring a young species into this environment before they are ready would not be a kindness, it would be a cruelty. We would be throwing them into waters too deep. They would struggle, and we would be responsible." He paused, letting the translators carry his words to every corner of the chamber. "I do not vote against humanity out of contempt. I vote against them out of concern. Let them grow. Let them learn. And when they are ready, truly ready, we will welcome them with open arms." It sounded so reasonable, so caring, so wise. The vote was called. The numbers appeared on every screen in the chamber, glowing in cold white light. Against, 4,187. In favor, 42. Abstentions, 81. Earth was excluded from the Galactic Council. The chamber hummed with quiet conversation. Thousands of delegates waited, watching the tiny human platform near the bottom of the vast room. Some expected anger, others expected tears, a few expected threats. Humans were aggressive after all. Everyone expected something dramatic. Ambassador Elara Mwangi stood slowly. She looked at the numbers on the screen for a long moment. Then she looked out across the chamber, at the Valith, at the Dracoon, at the Luminara, at the thousands of species who had just told her planet that it was not welcome. And she smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a forced smile, a real, warm, genuine smile, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. The chamber, for the first time in anyone's memory, went completely silent. 4,300 species watched Elara Mwangi smile, and not one of them understood what they were looking at. The silence in the conclave chamber was total. It pressed against the walls like something alive. On thousands of floating platforms, delegates from every corner of the galaxy sat perfectly still, waiting for what came next. They had seen rejection votes before. They knew how they were supposed to go. The rejected species would protest. They would argue. They would beg for a second chance. Some would make threats they could not back up. A few had even collapsed, their delegations falling apart on the chamber floor as the weight of galactic rejection crushed them. Nobody had ever smiled. Elara stepped forward to the edge of her platform. The movement was slow and unhurried, like someone walking to a window to enjoy a view. She placed her hands behind her back, and looked up at the vast amphitheater, filled with the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was carried by the translators to every platform, every pod, every corner of the chamber. It was steady. It was warm. There was no shake in it, no anger hiding beneath the surface, no carefully controlled pain. She sounded like someone who had just been told that a restaurant was full and was perfectly happy to eat somewhere else. "We came here to offer partnership," she continued. "We came with open hands and honest intentions. You have considered our offer and decided that the time is not right. We understand. We respect your decision. We hold no anger toward any species in this chamber." She paused, and the smile widened just slightly. "We wish you all well, and we hope that the future brings good things for every world represented here today." She gave a small nod, the kind of polite, final nod that humans give when a conversation is over, and turned away from the chamber. Her delegation stood as one, 12 people in simple blue uniforms, and they followed her toward the exit. Every single one of them was smiling. The doors of the conclave chamber closed behind them with a soft hiss. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then, on 100 platforms at once, conversations erupted. The translators struggled to keep up. The chamber buzzed with confusion, suspicion, and something that several species would later identify, with great discomfort, as unease. On the Dracoon platform, Warlord Kethon stared at the closed doors, with all 4 of his eyes. His second-in-command leaned over and asked what he made of it. "I don't know," Kethon said, and for a Dracoon, admitting that was almost painful. "I expected fire. I expected defiance. That was something else." "Perhaps they are simply weak," the second-in-command offered. "No," Kethon said slowly. "No, that was not weakness." On the Luminara platform, the elder who had attended Siveth's secret meeting the night before pulsed with troubled light. She turned to her aide and said, "Find out everything you can about what the humans do next. Everything." And high above the chamber, in his private observation pod, Counselor Siveth sat alone in the dark and watched the replay of Alara's speech on a loop. He watched it 7 times. Each time, he focused on her eyes, searching for the crack, the moment where the mask slipped, where the real emotion showed through. He never found it, because there was no mask. That was the thing that Siveth, with all his intelligence and all his experience, could not quite bring himself to believe. Alara Mwangi had not been performing. She had not been hiding her pain behind a brave face. She had walked into the most powerful room in the galaxy, been told she was not welcome, and felt genuinely, completely fine about it. That should not have been possible. Rejection by the Galactic Council was not a small thing. It affected trade. It affected security. It affected a species' standing in every interaction with every other civilization. Being excluded meant being alone in a galaxy that was very large and very dangerous. But the humans did not seem to care. Siveth pulled up his data screens again. He stared at the growth curves, the adaptation rates, the innovation indexes. And then he opened a new file, one his team had put together, on human psychology. He read about something called spite. He read about something called proving people wrong. He read about a human concept that translated roughly as, "Watch me." He closed the file and whispered to the empty room, "I think we just made a mistake." Meanwhile, Alara and her team walked through the corridors of Aethys Prime, toward the docking bay where the Perseverance waited. The station's hallways were wide and built for species of every size, from the tiny Gorothi to the massive Dracoon. The walls glowed with soft light. The air was filtered and clean, and carried faint traces of 1,000 different atmospheres. They were halfway to the ship when the first ambassador appeared. It was Voriel, the Gorothi delegate, the small, green-skinned amphibian who had spoken in humanity's favor during the debate. He came around a corner quickly, his large golden eyes darting left and right to make sure no one important was watching. "Ambassador Mwangi," he said, slightly out of breath, "please, a moment." Alara stopped and knelt so she was closer to his eye level. "Of course, Ambassador Voriel." "I am sorry about the vote," he said. "It was not fair. It was decided before it began." "We know," Alara said gently. "We knew before we came." Voriel blinked his enormous eyes. "You knew? Then why did you come?" Alara's smile returned, that same warm, knowing smile that had confused the entire conclave chamber. "Because we wanted to see who would stand with us, and who would stand against us, and who would come find us in the hallway afterward." Voriel stared at her for a long moment. Then he made a sound. A wet, bubbling noise that the translator rendered as laughter. "You are a very strange species," he said. "We get that a lot," Alara replied. Voriel was the first, but he was not the last. Over the next 2 hours, as the human delegation made their way slowly toward their ship, they were approached by more than 30 ambassadors from minor species. The Tessic trade representative came with a datapad full of new commercial proposals. A pair of Bell engineers arrived carrying schematics they wanted to share. 3 Nomari navigators offered star charts of routes the Council did not control. A delegation from a species called the Wren, who were so new to the galactic community that most people had never heard of them, simply came to say that they admired what the humans had done and wanted to be friends. Each time, Alara stopped. She shook hands, or touched foreheads, or performed whatever greeting was appropriate for the species in front of her. And she said the same thing to all of them. "We would love to talk more. Here is how to reach us." Her team handed out communication devices. Small, simple, human-made, nothing fancy. But they worked on every frequency the Council used, and a few that it didn't. By the time they reached the Perseverance, Alara had made more meaningful diplomatic contacts in 2 hours than most species made in 2 centuries. The ship undocked smoothly. It pulled away from Aethys Prime without ceremony, moving past the elegant alien vessels that dwarfed it on every side. On the station, a few observers watched it go. It was just a small, ugly ship, carrying a small, unimportant species back to their small, unimportant planet. On the bridge of the Perseverance, Alara stood at the center console and watched Aethys Prime shrink on the view screen. Her team was quiet around her, but the mood was not sad. It was electric. It was the feeling of a plan coming together. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small communicator. Not the ones they had handed out. This one was different. It was connected to a secure quantum channel that went straight to Earth, to a room beneath the mountains of Switzerland, where 12 people were waiting for one sentence. Alara pressed the button and spoke clearly. Green light on Project Outstretched Hand. On the other end, 12 people stood up from their chairs and got to work. On Aethys Prime, the conclave chamber was still buzzing with conversations about the humans. Theories were exchanged. Opinions were offered. Most species agreed that the humans had handled their rejection with surprising grace, and that this was probably the last anyone would hear from them for a very long time. They were wrong about that. They were very, very wrong. The first year was quiet. So quiet that most of the galaxy forgot about Earth entirely. The Galactic Council moved on. New trade disputes arose. Old territorial arguments resurfaced. The Dracoon threatened a border species. The Luminara held a spiritual congress that lasted 4 months and accomplished nothing. The Valith published new regulations about faster-than-light travel that made everything slightly more expensive for everyone. Business as usual. On Earth, 12 people in a room beneath the Swiss mountains worked around the clock. They called themselves the Outstretched Hand Committee, and they had been planning for this moment for 3 years, since long before Ilara Mwangi had ever set foot on Aethys Prime. The council vote had not been a surprise. It had been a starting gun. The plan was simple in concept and enormous in execution. Humanity would build its own network, not by conquering, not by threatening, not by begging the powerful for scraps. They would do it by being the one thing that the Galactic Council had never bothered to be: a good neighbor. Within 6 months, human trade ships were visiting every minor species that had approached Ilara in those hallways on Aethys Prime. The ships were still ugly. Humans never did figure out how to make their vessels look elegant, but they carried something more valuable than weapons or luxury goods. They carried engineers, doctors, teachers, and diplomats. And they carried a message that was almost shocking in its simplicity. What do you need? How can we help? The Garathi were the first to sign a formal partnership. Their homeworld was a water planet plagued by a fungal infection that was destroying their coral cities. Council scientists had studied the problem, declared it not a priority, and moved on. Human marine biologists arrived with equipment and curiosity and a stubborn refusal to accept impossible as an answer. It took them 8 months, but they found a treatment. The Garathi coral cities began to heal. The Garathi ambassador, Voril, wept on galactic broadcast. "They helped us," he said, his voice cracking. "They helped us because we asked, and for no other reason." The broadcast was watched by billions. On most council worlds, it was a minor story, buried beneath political news and entertainment. But on the outer rim, among the hundreds of small, overlooked, forgotten species that the council treated as background noise, it was an earthquake. The offers came flooding in. Species that had never spoken to a human before sent messages to Earth asking for help, for trade, for friendship. The Bell needed a new alloy for their construction projects. Human metallurgists worked with them to develop one. The Domari wanted to map a dangerous nebula region. Human astrophysicists joined the expedition. The Wren were being bullied by a larger neighbor. Human diplomats helped negotiate a peace agreement. And every time, the deal was the same. Equal partnership, no tribute, no demands for territory or loyalty. Just cooperation between equals, with both sides giving what they could and taking what they needed. By the end of the 2nd year, the Terran Cooperative Pact was born. It started with 47 species. Within a year, it was 112. By the end of the 4th year, over 200 species had signed on, and the TCP had become the fastest-growing alliance in galactic history. It had no grand capital station, it had no ancient traditions, it had no elder races dictating policy from above. What it had was something the Council had never offered, a seat at the table for everyone, regardless of size, age, or power. And then the innovation started. Humans, it turned out, were not just fast learners, they were fast combiners. They took Bell engineering and mixed it with Nomari navigation and Garathi biological science and their own stubborn creativity, and they made things that nobody had made before. In the 3rd year, a joint human-Bell research team cracked stable micro-wormhole technology, the ability to open small, temporary tunnels through space that allowed near-instant communication across any distance. The Veilith had said this was theoretically impossible. They had published papers proving it could not be done. The humans read the papers, disagreed, and did it anyway. The micro-wormhole network changed everything. Suddenly, TCP species could talk to each other in real time, no matter how far apart they were. Trade deals that used to take weeks to negotiate were done in hours. Scientific data was shared instantly. When a crisis hit one member species, the others knew about it immediately and could respond. The Council's communication system was still faster for point-to-point messages, but it was controlled by the Veilith, who charged fees for access and monitored all traffic. The TCP network was free, open, and private. The choice was obvious. The economic effects came next. TCP trade routes began to pull commerce away from council-controlled corridors. Human agricultural biotechnology, developed in partnership with the Garathi and 3 other species, revolutionized food production on dozens of worlds that had been dependent on expensive council imports. Bell human construction techniques made it possible to build habitats and stations at a fraction of the old cost. Slowly, then quickly, the money began to flow in a different direction. Of course, it noticed. In the 4th year, Warlord Kethon sat in his command chamber on the Drakun homeworld, and read a report that made his scales itch with irritation. 3 border skirmishes in the last month, all 3 against species that had previously been too weak and too frightened to fight back. All 3 lost. Not because the enemy had better weapons, though their weapons had improved, but because they fought with tactics that Kethon had never seen before. Coordinated, adaptive, unpredictable. They gave ground when pressed, then struck from angles that should not have been possible. They used terrain and timing and deception in ways that no species in Kethon's experience had ever used them. He pulled up the intelligence reports and found the answer. Human tactical advisors. Not soldiers, not warriors, just advisors. People who sat in rooms far from the battlefield and helped their allies think differently about conflict. Kethon put down the report and sat in silence for a long time. He remembered what he had said in the conclave chamber. Larvae. He had called them larvae. He did not feel like laughing anymore. The Luminara had their own problems. Their influence had always been spiritual. They positioned themselves as guides and philosophers, and thousands of species looked to them for wisdom. But human philosophy, human art, human music, human stories, these things were spreading across the outer rim like wildfire. Humans wrote stories about hope and struggle and overcoming impossible odds, and the forgotten species of the galaxy drank them in like water in a desert. A Garathi child's favorite song was a human lullaby. A Bell poet wrote verse in a human literary form. A Nomari captain named her ship after a human explorer. The Luminara held an emergency spiritual congress to discuss the cultural contamination. They debated for 3 months and could not agree on a response. By the time they finished debating, 6 more species had stopped attending their sermons. And through it all, Counselor Siveth watched. He had set up a dedicated monitoring station in his private quarters. A wall of screens showing data feeds from every corner of the galaxy. TCP membership growth, trade volumes, technology transfers, cultural influence metrics, military readiness assessments. He watched the numbers change day by day, and each day the picture became clearer and more terrifying. He had been right about the humans. They were exactly what he had feared they would be. Fast, adaptive, relentless. Not in the way of conquerors. They had not fired a single shot, had not claimed a single territory, had not made a single threat. They were relentless in the way that water is relentless. They found every crack and flowed through it. They wore down stone, not with force, but with patience. And the worst part, the part that kept Siveth awake in the dark hours, was that they were doing it with kindness. Genuine, bewildering kindness. They helped because they wanted to help. They shared because they believed in sharing. They built the TCP not as a weapon against the Council, but as a home for everyone the Council had left behind. How do you fight that? How do you fight someone who defeats you by being kind? In the 5th year, the Galactic Council held its annual summit. The conclave chamber was still vast, still impressive, still filled with floating platforms and holographic translators. But anyone who had attended the previous summit could see the difference. Platforms that had once carried delegations were empty. Species that had once competed for the best seats had simply stopped coming. The chamber was not half empty. Not yet, but the gaps were visible, and they were growing. The council's senior members looked at each other across the chamber, and for the first time in 4,000 years, they saw the same thing in each other's eyes. Fear. They called an emergency session, not about a war, not about a plague, not about an asteroid or an invasion or any of the threats that the council had been designed to face. About humanity. About a species that had been rejected and had responded by quietly, cheerfully, and without malice, building something better. The session was scheduled, the invitations were sent, and across the galaxy, the word spread. The council wanted to talk about the humans. On Earth, Ilara Mwangi received the news while sitting in her garden, drinking tea, and watching the sunset. She read the message, set down her cup, and laughed. A real full laugh that startled the birds from the trees. Then she picked up her communicator and called the Perseverance. "Warm up the engines," she said. "We're going back to Aethys Prime." 5 years changed a lot of things, but the Perseverance was not one of them. The ship came out of its faster-than-light jump with the same rough shudder and flickering blue light that it always had. It was still gray, still blocky, still looked like a collection of welded boxes with an engine stuck to the back. But this time, it did not arrive alone. Flanking the Perseverance on both sides were ships from 12 different species. A Garathi water vessel that moved like a living thing. A Bell construction cruiser covered in geometric patterns. A Nomari scout that was all curves and no edges. And 9 others. They flew in formation, which was something that would have been impossible 5 years ago, since none of these species had ever coordinated with each other before the humans came along. Now they flew together like they had been doing it all their lives. On the observation deck of Aethys Prime, nobody made dismissive comments this time. The station itself had changed. Not physically, it was still the same ancient structure orbiting the same dying star. But the atmosphere was different. The hallways that had once been crowded with delegates from thousands of worlds were quieter now. Platforms in the conclave chamber that had been assigned to species for centuries sat empty and dark. Trade stalls in the commercial district had closed. A whole section of the diplomatic wing had been shut down due to lack of use. And in the East Wing, where Section 47 had once smelled of chemicals and rejection, there was now a TCP embassy. It was staffed by Garathi administrators, Bell technicians, and human diplomats. The Garathi flag, a blue wave on a green field, hung beside the Earth flag in the corridor. Tessic merchants in the nearby promenade sold human coffee, Bell crystal art, and Nomari music recordings. A group of young aliens of 6 different species sat in a common area watching a human film on a shared screen, laughing at jokes that crossed every cultural line. This was what 5 years had built. Ilara Mwangi walked through the station with the same calm, steady stride she had used the first time. Her hair was a little more silver now, her face carried a few more lines, but her eyes were the same, warm, sharp, and impossible to read unless she wanted you to read them. She wore the same simple blue uniform with Earth's emblem on the shoulder. No jewels, no armor. Just a woman in a blue suit who had changed the galaxy without raising her voice. She was escorted not to Section 47, but to the central diplomatic corridor. A Valith official met her at the entrance, and this time it was not a minor functionary, but a senior diplomat. He bowed in the Valith fashion, all 4 arms folding inward, and said, "Ambassador Mwangi, the council is honored by your presence." "The honor is mine," Ilara said, and shook his hand. The conclave chamber was quieter than she remembered. Not silent. There were still over 2,000 species present, but the energy was different. 5 years ago, the chamber had buzzed with the confidence of an institution that believed it would last forever. Now it hummed with the nervous tension of people who could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. Ilara's platform rose to the center of the chamber. Not the bottom this time, but the very center, at eye level with the elder races. The council had made a point of giving her the best seat in the house. She appreciated the gesture, even though she knew what it meant. They were trying to make her feel important, so that she would give them what they wanted. The council speaker, a tall, crystalline being from a species so old that most records of their origins had been lost, opened the session with unusual brevity. The council has invited Ambassador Mwangi of Earth to discuss a matter of mutual importance. The council has voted to offer Earth not only full membership, but a senior advisory seat, in recognition of humanity's remarkable contributions to galactic progress. A pause. The chamber waited. Ambassador Mwangi, do you accept? Alara stood. She looked around the chamber the way she had 5 years ago, slowly, carefully, taking in every face and every platform. But this time, the eyes looking back at her were not amused or contemptuous. They were hungry, desperate, some of them, afraid, others. Thank you, she said, and her voice filled the chamber. I want to begin by saying something I mean with all my heart. We are grateful. Grateful for this offer, and grateful for the respect it represents. 5 years ago, we stood in this chamber and asked for a chance. You said no, and that was your right. She paused, and the smile came, that same smile, warm and genuine, and absolutely impossible to argue with. We are going to say no as well, and that is our right. The chamber erupted, not in shouting, the council was too civilized for shouting, but in a wall of urgent, overlapping conversation that the translators could barely handle. On 100 platforms, delegates turned to each other with expressions of shock, confusion, and something very close to panic. Ilara waited. She was very good at waiting. When the noise settled, she continued. Let me explain why. 5 years ago, you built a system where the powerful make the rules, and everyone else follows them. We do not say this to be cruel. It is simply what the council is. The elder races lead, the younger races obey, and the smallest species, the ones on the outer rim, the ones nobody remembers, the ones who needed help and never got it, they sit in the dark and hope that someone notices them. She took a breath. We built something different. The Terran Cooperative Pact is not perfect. Nothing built by living beings ever is. But it is built on one idea that we refuse to compromise. Every species has an equal voice. The Garathi have the same vote as humanity. The Bell have the same standing as the Nomari. A species that joined yesterday has the same rights as a species that joined on the first day. That is what we believe. And if we accepted a seat on this council, we would be saying that this system, your system, is good enough. It is not. The kind of silence that has weight. We did not do this to punish you, Alara said, and her voice softened. We did not build the TCP to destroy the council. We built it because billions of people across this galaxy were being ignored, and we could not ignore them. That is who we are. That is what humans do. When we see someone who needs help, we help. When we see a system that is broken, we try to build something better. She looked directly at the platforms of the elder races, at the Valith, at the Drakun, at the Luminara. The door is open. If any species in this chamber wants to join the TCP, they are welcome. Not as rulers, not as elders, as equals. That is the only offer we will ever make. She stopped speaking. The chamber was still. Then, from the Drakun platform, a sound like stone grinding against stone. Warlord Kethon was rising to his feet. He was older now. There were pale scars on his scales that had not been there 5 years ago, and he moved with the stiffness of someone who had spent too many years carrying too much weight. But his 4 eyes still burned like hot coals. The chamber held its breath. The Drakun were warriors. Their response to being challenged was always the same: aggression, dominance, force. Every species in the room was preparing for a threat, an insult, or a declaration of war. Kethin stared at Alara for a long time, long enough that the silence became uncomfortable, long enough that several minor delegations began edging toward their exits. Then Kethin raised his right fist and pressed it over both of his hearts, the left one and the right one. The Dracoon salute of a recognized equal. It was the highest honor a Dracoon could give to someone who was not Dracoon. In 4,000 years of Council history, it had been performed exactly twice. 5 years ago, I called you larvae, Kethin said, his deep voice rumbling through the chamber. I was wrong. You fought a war without firing a single shot, and you won. My people were built for battle, and we have never seen anything like it. He held the salute. I recognize you, Alara Mwangi, and I will take your offer to my people. He sat down. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the station's engines could be heard through the walls. One by one, other species began to stand. Not the elder races, not yet, but the mid-tier civilizations, the ones who had been loyal council members for centuries, but had watched the TCP grow with longing in their eyes. The Chalori stood, the Rel stood. Species that Alara did not know the names of stood on their platforms and looked at her with something she had seen many times before, on many different faces, human and otherwise. Hope. The last to speak was Councillor Siveth. He looked old, not just aged, broken, in the way that someone looks when they have spent years watching something they built fall apart and knowing it was their own fault. His compound eyes were dull. His forearms hung at his sides. When he spoke, his voice lacked the precision and control that the Valith were famous for. It was just the voice of a tired old man who had one more thing to say. I was the one who argued loudest against the humans, he said. I saw what they could become, and I was afraid. I thought that if I kept them out, I could keep the galaxy the way it was, stable, ordered, safe. He paused. I was right about what they would become. I was wrong about everything else. He turned to face the conclave, all 2,000 remaining species, and said the words that no Valith had ever spoken in 4 millennia of Council history. I move to dissolve the Galactic Council, and I petition, on behalf of the Valith people, to join the Terran Cooperative Pact, as equals. The motion was seconded, then seconded again, and again, and again, until the chamber was filled with voices calling for the same thing. Not all of them. Some platforms remained dark and silent, their delegates unwilling to let go of the old ways. But enough, more than enough. Alara watched it happen. She did not cheer. She did not gloat. She stood on her platform with her hands behind her back, and that smile on her face, the one that had confused the galaxy 5 years ago, and now, finally, everyone understood. It had never been defiance or spite, or the bravery of someone pretending not to be hurt. It was the smile of someone who had seen the future clearly and known with absolute certainty that everything was going to be all right. The conclave chamber went dark that evening. Its lights were shut off one section at a time, starting from the top and working down, until the last glow faded from the last platform, and 4,000 years of galactic governance ended in silence. Outside, through the vast windows of Aethys Prime, the stars were the same as they had always been, cold and bright and impossibly far apart. But among them, something new was growing. A network of small, ugly ships carrying engineers and doctors and teachers and diplomats. A web of connections between species that had never spoken before. A promise, kept by a species that was young and fragile and lived on a single pale blue dot in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. A promise that said, "You are not alone. You were never alone. We are here and we are not going anywhere." Alara Mwangi stood at the window of the Perseverance and looked out at the stars. Behind her, her crew celebrated quietly. Somewhere on the station, Voriel the Garathi was singing a human song he had learned from a recording. Somewhere else, Kethon the Dracoon was dictating a message to his homeworld. Somewhere, Siveth was sitting alone in a dark room, feeling lighter than he had in years. Alara watched the stars and smiled. Not because she had won, but because finally, nobody had lost.